And now for my next number, I'd like to return to the classics.
Welcome to the 1990s, a decade of blockbuster video. The Sony Discman.
You've got mail.
Don't you really want to know?
The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
And the only four-door sedan to ever be badged a Lotus. The Carlton was the Dodge Charger Hellcat red-eye wide body of its day, so irresponsibly, reprehensibly fast that the government asked its own maker to condemn it.
If you're an American child of the 1990s, you'll hear the name Carlton and think of the character from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which is ironic, alas, because The Fresh Prince was an examination of socioeconomic status. Will Smith, working class, sent to his upper-class auntie and uncle in Bel-Air.
As Americans, we identified with and rooted for working-class Will Smith and made fun of preppy Carlton. But the opposite tends to happen in the UK, where one does not mock revered members of society, and it's kind of encouraged to look down on the working class. So when General Motors gave the peasants as much speed as the rich people had already been enjoying in their Ferraris, well, why, it really rocked their wigs. Criminals will be driving these extraordinarily fast machines, they cried. And they were right.
Okay. Cut it.
First things first for y'all Americans, Opel was the brand name under which General Motors sold cars in Europe. In the United Kingdom, Opel was called Vauxhall.
In 1987, Opel came out with an all-new rear-wheel drive sedan called the Omega. In the UK, it was badged Vauxhall Carlton, and it was large by 1980s European car standards, meaning it's the same size as today's Honda Civic. The Omega Carlton twins immediately won the 1987 European Car of the Year award and were met with much acclaim, especially for their stellar aerodynamic properties. With a drag coefficient as low as 0.28, they could attain high speeds without a lot of fuel or power.
And the Carltomega didn't have a lot of power. The base gas engine made just 80 horsepower, but that was enough for over 110 miles an hour. And even though the biggest engine only made 156 horsepower, well, that was good for $135, which was serious speed in the late 1980s.
But it wasn't enough. See, the man in charge of General Motors was a car guy, and he didn't like that GM Europe had a reputation for making boring, uninspiring cars that used outdated tech. Like, for example, the 20-year-old straight six that made only 156 horsepower out of 3 liters. Opel was working on a 24-valve head for it, but that wasn't enough for Bob. Or for Mike Kimberly, the boss of Lotus, the company that GM had just purchased.
Lotus was more than just a car company. Lotus was a consultant. And aside from the obvious things like engineering the entire DeLorean, Lotus had its grubby, secretive little fingers in cars from almost every automaker around the globe, including GM.
In fact, when the Omega came out, Lotus was in the process of creating the LT5, the quad-cam 32-valve aluminum block monster-slaying V8 for the king of the Hill Corvette ZR-1. And Bob Eaton thought a stupidly fast sedan would be the right way to show the world that Opel wasn't boring.
Boy, was he wrong. But we'll get there in a second.
In 1988, the project started using Opel's flagship Senator, which was confusingly actually the same car as the Carltomega, just with old man styling on it. Under the hood would be that Lotus-developed Corvette ZR-1 V-8, but Bob Eaton wanted the sedan to debut alongside the ZR-1 at the 1989 Geneva Auto Show, which was only a couple of months away.
Problem was, a V8 wouldn't fit between the V platform's front frame rails without extensive structural modification. And that meant engineering cost and rehomologation for crash tests, but most importantly, time, which they didn't have.
So out went the LT5, and Lotus's Etna V8, and the 5-liter V8 from GM's Australian brand, Holden.
Instead, the engineers concentrated on the old straight six, with and without the forthcoming 24-valve head, with and without turbochargers, and in 3.0, 3.6, 3.9, and 4-liter displacements. But it didn't work. The hot senator, a phrase that certainly no one has ever said before, wouldn't work because it would be too expensive, it would sell in too few units, and it would be confusing to customers because the senator as a lineup had no sporting chops to begin with.
The Carltomega, despite being the same car, did. There were already the sporty Omega 3000/Carlton GSI models, and a 24-valve variant was coming. So, just 6 weeks before the sportiest Lotus sedan thing would make its debut at Geneva, the whole project switched from the Senator to the Carltomega, with the goal of being the best and fastest accelerating sports sedan on the planet.
To do that, Lotus took Opel's brand new 24-valve head and bolted it on to the old straight 6, now stroked out to 3.6 liters, and then added not 1, but 2 turbochargers. The result was 377 horsepower, 2 more than the Corvette ZR-1 King of the Hill V-8. And this made 419 pound-feet of torque, which was 50 more than the Corvette's. And by the way, 150 pound-feet of torque more than the next most powerful sedan, the BMW M5, which this would leave for dead.
There was only one transmission in the world that could handle that torque output, and it was the ZF 6-speed developed for the Corvette ZR-1. And Lotus wound up having to fight with GM to get it because Chevy had an exclusive and had no interest in helping Lotus.
Opel had no interest in helping Lotus either. In fact, Opel stood in Lotus's way almost every step along the way. Look, this was completely overshadowing Opel's own 3-liter 24-valve variant. And so likely out of jealousy, Opel flat out refused to build the Lotus variant on the regular Carltomega production line. Excuse me, my beeper's going off. That's rather embarrassing. Gotta take this.
So the only way Lotus could actually make this car was the most outrageously expensive waste of natural resources to ever contradict the simplify and add lightness mantra. Opel would produce a bog-standard 24-valve Opel Omega 3000 or Vauxhall Carlton GSI and send it factory fresh from Rüsselsheim, Germany to Hethel, England, wearing placeholder bumpers and wheels. Then Lotus would attack it, stripping the car half apart, pulling the doors off, interior out, and then yanking the powertrain and shipping it back to Germany to be put in another car.
Next up, the gentlefolk at Lotus walked up to their brand new car and took a plasma cutter to the wheel arches and hacked up the floor pan so it could fit the ZF 6-speed, and attached the Opel-designed fender flares and modified body panels, and then had to re-rust-proof the whole car and touch up all of the imperial green paint, which was, by the way, the only color you can get. See? It's green.
And then in went the big motor and AP racing brakes and Ronal 17-inch monoblock wheels and a limited slip diff from the Holden Commodore.
Next up, a fully reworked suspension, including self-leveling at the back, because Lotus was concerned that the semi-trailing arm rear suspension exhibited too much camber change when fully loaded for safe continual operation at top speed. If you're a Lotus engineer, this is the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night.
Finally, Lotus slapped on a Lotus VIN because Opel refused to allow it to be called an Opel or a Vauxhall.
Ta-da! The Lotus Omega, or if it's right-hand drive, the Lotus Carlton. Not to be confused with Carlton Banks, who's the Fresh Prince's cousin.
All that work at Hethel took 130 man-hours, not counting building the engine. So as you can imagine, this was an expensive car. In Germany, it cost more than twice what a fully kitted Omega 3000 24-valve cost, which itself was almost twice what a base Omega cost.
So 4 times the price, but more than 3 times the horsepower on a car that, if you remember, didn't need a lot of horsepower to go fast in the first place. So this thing had a top speed of 177 miles an hour, making it, by some margin, the fastest regular production sedan in the world.
Actually, it was certified at 182 miles an hour by the German government. Though that car might have been running the cheater programming that was on the cars that Lotus gave to the media. Allegedly, you can activate that programming by turning on the headlights, starting the engine, and holding it at 2,000 RPM for 30 seconds. And the first time I floored it, whoa, what the f***ing hold?
fucking licked it. Oh my.
This thing is insanely fast.
And listen, it's not like the Carltomega was some sort of tuner special that took off at high speeds. No, this thing was as aerodynamically stable at Ferrari Testarossa speeds as a regular Omega was parked. And I bring up the Ferrari Testarossa not just because the Carlton can keep up with one, but because no one in the world had a problem with a 180-mile-an-hour Ferrari. But everyone in the UK had a problem with a 180-mile-an-hour Vauxhall. Everyone, including, of course, the police and the government, but also automotive journalists. We're supposed to love this stuff. Wow.
The Association of Chief Police Officers called it an outrageous invitation to speed.
Before the car even entered production, the editor of Autocar magazine wrote a scathing op-ed recommending that Vauxhall limit the Carlton's top speed. High top speeds, whether they are used or not, are an essential ingredient in uncompromised sports cars. But Vauxhall Carltons? No, this is marketing at work, a dangerous example of ours is better than yours immaturity. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, but the uncompromised sports car thing really strikes a bad note, especially because our little hypocrite Bob had just crashed an uncompromised sports car with a Ferrari badge on it 1 year earlier.
A short while later, just 2 months after the first Carlton was delivered to its owner, Bob Eaton's attempt at making GM Europe cool wound up becoming the poster child for all that was wrong in British society. Here's an excerpt from the Parliament House of Commons transcript from some guy named Tony.
It is ludicrous that motor car manufacturers should be advertising cars that have maximum speeds of 140, 150, 170 miles an hour. Some of those products are cheap cars that may be purchased by those who are incapable of driving them safely.
To which the Baron Carlyle of Berrieux responded,
Will the honorary gentleman join me in condemning especially the heavy publicity given recently to a Vauxhall Carlton, which is capable, apparently, of achieving 170 miles an hour? It should not be available for sale to the public, even at the outrageous price of, I think, £45,000. And there it is.
The problem wasn't that the Lotus Carlton could do 180 miles an hour. The problem wasn't that the Lotus Carlton was inherently unsafe at 180 miles an hour. The problem was that the Lotus Carlton was inexpensive. Outrageous price of $45,000? Come on, a Testarossa cost twice that.
They were pissed that the middle class could afford it. Look, the UK is a classist society, and the people who bought Vauxhalls, well, they were kind of like the people who buy Dodge Chargers today. Yep.
As, trashy Americans, we love that for the price of a sport package on a Ferrari, some redneck can buy an 807 horsepower Dodge Charger. Hell, Dodge calls it the jailbreak, because they know exactly who's going to buy it and what they're going to do with it.
I'm sorry, that is totally awesome. Here's what's not awesome. A bunch of sophisticates in wigs telling the general public that if you're rich enough, you can handle a 180-mile-an-hour Ferrari Testarossa. But if you don't have a sir in your name, well, you're just going to take a fast car and use it to commit crimes. I'm not making this up. That was one of their actual arguments. And here is the best part. They were totally right.
3 years later, a Carlton was stolen by a gang of people who probably weren't aristocrats. Over the next couple of months, they used it to ram raid stores and steal 20,000 pounds worth of cigarettes and booze. And there was nothing the cops could do about it, because nothing could keep up with the Lotus Carlton. Certainly not the cop cars, so these guys had no problem knocking over a store 30 yards from a police station.
There are all kinds of stories about police helicopters not being able to keep up with these things, but that's ridiculous. They couldn't go all that far. According to Lotus, their 18-gallon fuel tanks would be empty after just 40 minutes at top speed, which is probably for the better because the transmission and diff would start to overheat after 30 minutes. So they're not properly engineered. Shut up. Have a sense of humor. Lotus only made 320 of the Carlton sedans, 950 of these things in total.
This was just an image maker, not a transportation device for the masses. And think about the irony of that. GM buys Lotus so it can use Lotus's engineering might to help sportify the company's image. And it turns into a PR nightmare, backfiring to the point that Vauxhall stops advertising the top speed of the fastest sedan in the world.
Isn't it ironic? Don't you think? Yeah, it is Alanis because that is the awesomest FU to a stuffy, classist bunch of twats who on their very best day couldn't understand the Carlton. Okay, so this car is actually genuinely modern sports sedan fast. What, you've never experienced one? Well, you should go over to Hagerty's Marketplace, which is a website where we have classified ads and auctions, and maybe one of these things will be for sale. Maybe this thing will be for sale. In fact, you'll never know unless you go. God, I can't get that. So gross.